You believe the chair you're sitting in will hold your weight, and that the sun will rise tomorrow, and that the food that you're going to eat next is not poisoned. Your entire life runs on assumptions that you've never actually proven, you can't prove, and you don't even question to think about most of the time. And it's not because you're an irrational person, but because you have something more basic than proof guiding you, something that is more foundational than logic, data, or even evidence. Plausibility. Plausibility is not the same thing as truth. It's the first mental filter that you use before you ever get to the truth. Before science and reasoning and testing and facts, your brain has, most of the time, already decided what feels worth considering and what doesn't. And in a world flooded with misinformation, conspiracy theories, emotional manipulation, and influencer nonsense, understanding plausibility might be the closest thing you have to a psychological immune system. To really get why this matters, we need some clarity. Plausibility is not probability. Probability comes a little later, after you have gathered data and you've run the calculations. Plausibility decides what data you even bother collecting. If someone said, there might be invisible dinosaurs behind your house, technically that's possible, but you're not going to grab a shovel to investigate because you have evidence against it. Not because you've calculated the odds, but because your brain has tossed it into the idea of not plausible enough to care about before logic even has kicked in. Plausibility also is not certainty, because certainty is math. 2 plus 2 equals 4. But in the real world, almost nothing gives you that certainty. Every meaningful decision that you make happens in the foggy zone of seems good enough. So how does your brain decide what seems to be right? Well, there are 4 pillars that work together like the legs of a table. The first is convergence. This is when multiple independent sources of information all point to the same conclusion. If you only heard thunder but you didn't see lightning, you might wonder if it was construction noise. And if you only saw lightning without thunder, you would question the distance or timing. But when you see lightning and you hear thunder, your brain says the storm is confirmed. And that's convergence. Different channels telling the same story. And it's also why science loves measurements. You might not trust one thermometer, but when 10 different instruments in 10 different cities register the same temperature trend, then skepticism starts to shrink. Convergence builds trust because the odds of multiple independent sources being wrong in the same way are extremely low. Not impossible, but low enough for your brain to lean in. The second pillar is elegance. Elegance is when one idea can explain a lot without needing 17 separate patches and extra assumptions. Think about gravity. One principle, that mass curves space-time, explains falling apples, planetary orbits, tides, spinning galaxies, and why you don't fall off the planet. It's elegant and efficient and travels across contexts. On the other hand, imagine someone trying to explain traffic by saying, okay, sometimes it's the lights, but sometimes it's invisible traffic gnomes, and other times Mercury retrograde creates road magnetism, but only on Tuesdays. Now, that's not elegant. It's just a conspiracy corkboard. Elegance gives a theory reach. It gives you predictive power and says this doesn't just explain what I've already seen, but might explain what I haven't seen yet. Convergence builds the trust, but elegance builds usefulness. But the catch is, each one by itself can trick you. So we need a third pillar, balance. Too much convergence without enough elegance gives you something true but useless. People get thirsty when they don't drink water. Pretty accurate and supported by endless evidence, and completely trivial. It doesn't explain your understanding in any meaningful way and has no explanatory depth. On the flip side, too much elegance without convergence gives you something fascinating but detached from reality. The elites are secretly lizard beings controlling Earth through Wi-Fi mind control towers. Does it explain confusing world events in one dramatic sweep? Sure. Is there independent evidence converging on it? No. Big elegance, zero convergence. Or fantasy. The sweet spot is when evidence stacks and the idea explains more than it required you to swallow. And that is plausibility's power zone. The fourth pillar is coherence. This is where everything starts to click into place in a structured, functional whole instead of a pile of bullet points taped together. Imagine someone tries to define a bird by simply listing traits: wings, feathers, beak, flight. Then they glue feathers and wings onto a brick and throw it off a building. It meets the checklist, but it's definitely not a bird, because it lacks the internal structural logic that makes a bird a system that works. Coherence means the explanation has a skeleton, not just the sparkly accessories. It connects internally and rules things in and out. But plausibility doesn't just guide everyday assumptions like chairs and sunsets. It happens to shape all of human reasoning. Scientists don't test every possible hypothesis. They only test the plausible ones, and don't rule out every imaginary alternative explanation. But they do rule out the plausible competing explanations. And they don't chase every random criticism, but only address the plausible ones. Without plausibility, the scientific method wouldn't really even start. You would be stuck trying to disprove an infinite number of absurd possibilities before you could ever investigate anything meaningful. Plausibility is the filter that makes inquiry possible. And this is where psychology, evolution, and even AI oddly collide. There is a pattern called deep learning, and not just the computer kind, but the biological kind. It works in cycles. First, you compress. You take in a massive amount of chaotic information and extract the stable patterns, the convergence, and then you generate variation. You mentally play with those patterns, stretching them into new territory, the elegance, and then you test what holds up, discard what doesn't, update the pattern, and repeat. This is how babies learn languages, and how scientists form theories, and even how AI learns to recognize specific objects. Plausibility is the mental shortcut version of that cycle. Convergence equals compression. Elegance equals expansion. Balance equals reality check. And coherence equals system integrity. Your brain is constantly asking, does this line up with what I already trust? And can this explain more than I previously understood? If the answer to both is yes, then it feels more plausible. Not necessarily certain or proven, but plausible. Plausibility is the scaffolding of understanding. It's not necessarily the finish line, but it is the gatekeeper. and it determines what enters your mind, what stays, and what gets dismissed before it ever wastes your attention. And in a world engineered to compete for your attention, your ability to judge plausibility might be the most valuable cognitive skill that you can sharpen. Because even though it might not necessarily guarantee truth, it does steer you towards ideas that are worth the search for the truth in the first place. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see y'all next time.